Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. I used to believe it was just a nightmare or an overactive imagination, similar to what happens to kids who watch scary movies before bed. But as I grew older, I began to forget that face, the man in the window, his glowing inhuman eyes, and the shape of his bald head against the pale blue sky just before dawn. When I was 4 or 5 years old, my twin brother Eli and I slept a bunk bed in the final room down the hallway of a little house on Willow Court, a quiet neighborhood in the small Georgia town of at the age of 9 or 10. Our older sister, Hannah, lived in the room across from ours. She assumed the role of a mother figure that older siblings often take on when their parents are overburdened. Our mom, Carrie, and dad, Mark, worked part-time at a lumber supply warehouse and with the county police department. The night was supposed to be normal, juggling PTA meetings, church choir, and getting Eli and me to speech therapy 45 minutes away. I don't remember much of the day, probably a typical school day with chicken nuggets for lunch and some cartoons before bed, but I do remember the dream, which I will never forget. Eli was asleep above me as I lay in bed, nestled into the bottom bunk. The sky was deep red, not fire red, but rather the weird murky light you get just before sunrise. This man with a beard was standing just outside the glass of our bedroom window. I couldn't move, my lips opened, but no sound came out, and then I yelled a long, heart-stopping scream. His eyes were like the blue of a TV screen left on in the dark, and he didn't knock or speak. I remember my mom running in and picking me up as I was shaking uncontrollably, and she smelled like coffee and laundry detergent. She carried me down the hall, but I remember thinking, where's Dad? Why isn't he coming? That's all I remember. I chalked it up to childish terror, but it haunted me for years. Fast forward 25 years, and in May, I'm standing on a balcony in Cartucker, Columbia, with my dad in the intensive care unit. The rest of us, Eli and Hannah, live back in the United States, but when the news came in, we dropped everything and traveled down that night. He has been living here with his second wife 4 years, and San Vicente Medical is just hanging on. Eli, Hannah, and I were 3 siblings who were linked by sadness and the kind of tiredness that only family situations can bring. We drank a few drinks to try to ease our stomach knots, and the topic of dreams somehow came up on the rooftop of a budget hotel 5 minutes from the hospital. Since none of us had been getting much sleep, I added, I had this weird nightmare when I was a kid, and as I concluded, I must have terrified myself half to death, because Hannah didn't laugh. Instead, she simply stared at me. You don't remember? She questioned, slack beer halfway to her lips. What? Once it had been happening 4 days. A guy in Hannah's voice didn't falter as she told us everything. Her tone changed to that wasn't a dream, that really happened. She was always riding her bike with friends when a dark green truck followed her home. At first, she assumed it was just a guy who took the same route, but after the 3rd or 4th time, she realized he had this face that she couldn't forget, she said with an overly broad smile. Additionally, our area was still backed up to a tiny industrial lot with rusting machinery, old tracks, and a jumble of dense woods that no child should play in. The man would park his vehicle there and walk, and the previous evening, she noticed him from her window and stood there observing. At midnight, Hannah heard a huge window across the hall from ours jitter, and then push a slow sliding sound. She got up and saw that he was bald and pale. That night, Hannah had gone to bed late reading under the covers, Hannah said she heard the snap, and those same electric blue eyes I saw in the dream were there as she screamed loud enough to wake the entire block. My dad then went for the window, grabbed his extended baton from the dresser, and got hit just as he was sliding it open. However, the man slipped away, but he stayed put for a minute. He was at Eli's and my windows, and he tried to open them, but ours was locked, thank God. The loud scream I gave out wasn't a dream. Went zero. My mom seized us and held us tight as we were crying, and my dad fled into the night in the back. But the man never returned, at least not that we believe he did, and we didn't discuss it again until that evening on the Columbian balcony. Why didn't anyone ever tell me? I said, sitting there in disbelief with a half-empty beer bottle clenched in my fist. Hannah shrugged. You were a kid. Mom thought you were too young. And you yelled so loudly that you couldn't recall. What transpired? What did the police do? Eli, who had been silent the entire time, eventually remarked, I think I remember something. Slowly, read a red sky and Mom crying. We combed the neighborhood, but we never discovered the man or his truck. After our dad passed away 2 days later, we sat in quiet since no one knew what to say. There was a ton of paperwork to do, funeral preparations to make, and family to notify with the embassy, but I couldn't sleep at night because the nightmare had returned, not the same one, but the same man watching all the time. When I flew home, I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I began looking through old police reports and newspaper archives, and I even called a retired. I explained to the Shadewood Police Department officer that I was looking into local crimes from the 1990s for a project. At first, I couldn't find anything, but then I came across a police report from 3 weeks after our break-in that indicated a 12-year-old girl from our elementary school had gone missing and was discovered 2 days later, still alive but afraid. She told me that a bald man tried to drag her into his truck near the same industrial park, but she bit his arm to get away and fled into traffic. Her description exactly matched ours, so I located her. Her name is Morgan Sharp, and she teaches 4th grade in Kansas. I sent her an email, not expecting a response, but she did respond, but her letter was brief. She recalled everything, and she still experiences nightmares. She stated, I'll never forget what he looked like because I saw his eyes, which are not human-like to screens lit up in the dark. Didn't you see him too? He first saw me last month when I returned to Shadewood. The home is still there, but the color and layout have changed. The trees are taller, the fence is drooping, and the industrial park behind it has been demolished and replaced with low-cost condos. The woods are still dark and dense, and when I stood at the edge and looked into them, I swear something, not a man, not a human being anymore, something that looks through windows and waits for kids to forget, started back at 2 a.m. I occasionally see a glow on screens on windows in the reflection of my microwave, but I have searched every news website, database, and record and found nothing on him, not even a sketch, no arrest, no photo, on that same shade of blue. And occasionally when I close my eyes, I see his silhouette still bald, still observing, and I wonder if he ever left or if he's still searching for another window where a child shouts loud enough to recall that I had little safety net at the time, and that this incident occurred roughly 6 years ago when I was in my early 20s and still not even enough to think that everything would work out because it had to. I had recently moved to the city of Larchwood, which is not far from where my plan was to move in with my ex-boyfriend, but that fell through when he cheated on me 2 weeks before our lease was set to begin. I was left without a place to live and not enough money to buy anything on my own, so I scrambled with my roommates. It's funny how quickly desperation can set in, can override caution. I ended up living with 3 guys I didn't know very well to were complete strangers, and one, Ryan, whom I had met at a party the previous year through a mutual friend. He seemed quiet and kind of nerdy, and he worked the night shift at a UPS warehouse, meant that we wouldn't be in each other's way too much. The other 2 were Josh and Derek, friends who had recently moved from out of state. When we first met in the house, Josh talked too much and Derek hardly spoke at all, but neither of them raised any red flags. The house itself was an old divided two-story and the sketchier part of Larchwood. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't the kind of place where you'd leave windows open at night. The top floor was its own unit, and I didn't realize at the time that I should have been more cautious of people who don't set off alarms. Sometimes it's not the loud ones you need to be concerned about. Similar to a duplex, but with internal stairs, Ryan and I got the upstairs, which had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, an ancient living room, and creaking floors. Josh and Derek were still moving in on the bottom floor, which had a lot of stuff. I recall thinking it was odd that they chose a rundown old house with a cracked porch and a door that didn't work, but Josh had several gaming consoles, a custom-built PC, 3 TVs, and Derek was into music production and had thousands of dollars in audio equipment. Always latch right. I've always been cautious. Even when I'm by myself, I lock my bedroom door and check all the windows before turning in for the night. My mother used to say that I was born afraid, but it's more like a 6th sense than actual fear. And that feeling began to nag at me a few days after I moved in. I recall that it was a Tuesday, and I was happy for a day to relax because I had intended to see a friend in the next city over, but the train I was meant to catch was cancelled. Josh and Derek were supposed to be out all afternoon moving the last of their belongings in, and Ryan had already left for his shift. I made myself some pasta, watched a forgettable Netflix episode, and then went upstairs to my bedroom, locked the door behind me as usual, put on my headphones, and about 20 minutes after I began catching up on work emails, I heard the front door open downstairs. This might have been an early return, but then I heard heavy footsteps, cupboards opening, and the scraping sound of I paused the music and took out my headphones as I heard furniture being pulled, not like someone coming home, but more like someone tearing the place apart. There were more thuds and crashes, and I tiptoed to my door, scarcely breathing, before hearing sluggish footfall on the stairs. I took 1 step, 2, 3 steps, 4 steps closer, and my thumb shook as I dialed 911, the voice on the other end barely managed to say hello before I whispered, "Someone's in the house. I don't think they know I'm home." I was purposefully not in a rush, like someone running up to grab something they forgot, just climbing. "Please send someone to my upstairs bedroom since the door is locked and the doorknob jiggled just enough to chill me. Are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here," I said, crouching next to my bed with my phone held so tightly against my ear that it hurt. "Police are on their way. Stay quiet. Could you describe the individual?" "I didn't see them," I muttered, thinking my roommates had left. I doubt anyone knew I would be home because the doorknob stopped. For a brief while, I believed they had gone, but then I heard a quiet dragging sound, like someone dragging their fingers across the wall. I don't recall much of the next 2 minutes, just that they felt like hours, during which I was immobile and unable to even think before sounds. My hands were shaking so much when I finally unlocked my door after the police arrived in less than 4 minutes and swept the house. I didn't leave until I heard one of the cops shout, "Clear." The downstairs looked like a war zone after I dropped my phone. Drawers had been pulled out, dishes had been taken out, couch cushions had been destroyed. Derek's speakers had been gutted, Josh's PC tower had been ripped open, one of the TVs had been cracked as if it had been hurled to the ground, and worse, the back door had been pried open. The police didn't find anyone because whoever did it fled as soon as they heard the sirens, but they didn't leave empty-handed. Open whomever it was, they hadn't entered by the front. They had broken in from the backyard, and they slipped in while I was upstairs, assuming no one was home. Derek later calculated that more than $22,000 worth of gadgets had been taken, items he had hardly unpacked, and most frightening of all, the police reported seeing 2 sets of tracks ascending the stairs, even though nothing physically occurred. To me, after that night, I couldn't sleep for months because I felt like I had been shattered by the thought that someone had been directly outside my door, presumably thinking the upstairs was unoccupied. I couldn't stop wondering if they had gotten. Ryan attempted to minimize the incident, saying it was likely only a smash and grab, and that you were never in danger. However, I thought I had forgotten how the doorknob shook slowly, as if they were checking rather than hurrying the test listening. A few days later, things worsened, and Josh began accusing Derek of putting it up, saying he was suspicious that it was too convenient and that he wasn't present when after the break-in. Derek began locking his door and playing loud music, while hardly speaking to anyone. I tried to avoid getting involved, but I couldn't help but notice how they continued to leave doors unlocked despite what had happened twice. When I returned home, I discovered the back door wide open, and when I asked why, they shrugged. I didn't ask for permission or care for installing a chain lock on the upstairs door for the third time. But it wasn't just paranoia anymore. I began to notice that objects moved when I wasn't home, including my bedroom window, which I stopped taking showers when I was alone at home, and one night at around 3 in the morning, I discovered my toothbrush on the floor. I also started putting pepper spray next to my bed. The entry to the attic was in the ceiling of the upstairs corridor, sealed shut, and there were no stairs or ladders. So when I woke up to footsteps again, not from below, but from the attic above me, I froze. Nothing Ryan had said, but I heard someone moving cautiously and slowly years ago when the house was converted. I held my breath for so long that I almost fainted, but finally the sound ceased, and the following morning I told Ryan he probably squirrels. He joked, "It's an old house." However, I recognized the sound of footfall and knew they weren't squirrels. So 2 weeks later I relocated. When I called the landlord that evening to inform him that I was ending my lease early, he didn't protest. Instead, he simply stated, "You're not the first." I had departed without warning, packing up whatever I could fit in my car and leaving in the middle of the day when no one else was home. I later learned that the house had experienced 2 break-ins prior to our move. With the same back door and lost electronics, the police never apprehended anyone, and I'm still unsure of who attempted to enter my door that evening. All I know is that, if I hadn't secured it, I probably wouldn't be here to share this story. I always heard people talk about instincts as if they were some sort of pre-existing sixth sense, but I always assumed it was just anxiousness. This occurred in November 2022, when I was living in Bulletin, a regional town about an hour and a half from Melbourne, and I had just finished a long, exhausting day of work. I now know better, though, that there is a difference between nerves and knowing something is wrong. My job as a nurse kept me busy enough, and between the long shifts and the quiet evenings by myself, I figured it couldn't hurt to download Hinge again. His name on the app was Marco Elias, and his profile stood out. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just someone to talk to, maybe grab a drink. In almost every picture, he appeared well-groomed, as if he was an expert with a camera and a good tailor. He exuded sophistication, with wine glasses, dinner parties, and even a private jet in the background. His profile was brief and described him as a proficient traveler and entrepreneur. I rolled my eyes at the last line, which was in Portuguese, with sarcasm, but I swiped right nevertheless, and a few minutes later, he matched me and wrote me a message finally. "Someone who doesn't open with 'Hey, refreshing.'" I said, "I like your coat, makes you look like a Bond villain." And then we were off, and I chuckled. Within a day, Marco requested that we meet at St. Martin's Bar, a chic rooftop venue in the city, rather than Bullerin. Even though he was staying in Melbourne for work, I was hesitant, but he offered to cover all costs and even reserve the table in advance. Before I left, I texted a friend my location just in case. I wasn't sure whether to salute him or shake his hand because he looked like he had walked out of a movie. He had leather gloves in his pocket, a fitted navy trench coat, and tall, dark hair that was slicked back. I didn't think anything bad would happen because he met me at Southern Cross Station. Before I could react, he drew me into an embrace, and gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, saying, "God, you smell amazing." He claimed that my brain was already catching up, so he took my hand and led me out, as if we had known each other for ages. He told me that he was born in São Paulo, raised in Lisbon, and moved to Australia for university, but that I've made this place my home. He said that the bar was full, but that he had reserved a private table. So we ordered cocktails and the conversation flowed. He asked me about my family, career, and early years, and I replied. When I inquired about his, he offered me a life tale that sounded like something from Netflix, claiming that his father had died when he was his mother, had suffered, so at the age of 10 he was sent to live with his extended family in Portugal, where he completed his education. He said that at the age of 18, he returned to Brazil, where he was reunited with his mother, and that he finally arrived in Australia on a study visa. I studied engineering, but I detested it. I wanted to work in logistics. There was no reason not to trust him. He appeared sincere, polite, and even chivalrous in an archaic way. And transport something that moves the world. You know it was well practiced, presented like he'd told us 100 times. Extravagant way we spent the night in his temporary apartment close to the Docklands. He offered me up to chat, and I accepted, telling myself I would go before midnight. I was very aware of all the warning signs I was ignoring. He said he remembered I wanted to learn salsa, and thought he'd give me a preview. I laughed and told him he was crazy, but he pulled me in gently and showed me a few steps in the small space between the couch and the kitchen bench. It was cheesy as hell, candles, soft music, and salsa, specifically red wine already poured. He didn't push things, so we fell asleep on the couch, completely clothed, but it worked. The following morning, he escorted me out, called a cab, and texted me for the remainder of the day. "You made last night feel like a dream," and I was captivated. God help me. I was in love, and the love bombing began right away. 3 days later, he sent me a box of lingerie, but I didn't tell him my size. A few days later, he gave me a pair of gold earrings in a velvet box. By the time my birthday arrived, he had hardly met me. In the second week, he offered me to a week-long vacation in Queensland, which included flights, a private boat cruise, a friend's restaurant with a special menu, a helicopter ride for the view, and flowers, a bracelet, and a certificate for a luxury spa. He claimed I didn't need to pack. He took care of the lingerie, and then the alarm went off. I don't have any family who would miss me if I disappeared, and all of a sudden, the man I hardly knew was promising me the kind of vacation you see in movies just before someone is killed in Act 2, worked in shipping. He claimed that I understood. The irony. I made a joke that he could likely send me away without a trace, but he laughed too much. I needed to find out who he was, and my roommate helped me do it. He had no family members mentioned on social media. His Facebook page had an odd lock on it, but it displayed an old photo from 2016 with the comment, "So happy for you and Camila, you two are perfect together, Camila." His Instagram posts featured him alone in suits at airports, hotel rooms, and even by a pool. I found her account buried in his followers, a woman around 35, Brazilian. Her photos were all old, and none with him recently, but one had him in the background at a dinner table with a caption, "Family is everything." At that point, I transferred him $1 using my banking app and using Pay ID. When I googled it, Marco Vega Santos, not Elias Vega Santos, was the registered name that appeared. It took hours to locate Camila's name, but when I did, I discovered that it was a settlement hearing in a Brazilian civil court over unpaid bills. Their names were listed as husband and wife, and I froze. I requested him to email me a picture of his passport, claiming that my friend required his information to protect me. He hesitated before the trip, but eventually sent it with his hand covering half of his face and most of the details blacked out, but not sufficiently. He was born in 1985 and wasn't 28, as he claimed to be. Instead, he was 37. I chose to play along over the next 2 The final straw was when he informed me that his grandmother in Lisbon had suffered a stroke and that he had to fly there right away. I called Camila, but I didn't know why he kept changing the dates of his flights and making excuses. His business trip was prolonged, and his mom had surgery. If she would respond, but she did, and we spoke over the phone, and she told me everything. In a trembling voice, Marco had never lived in Portugal. His family was middle class in Brazil, and he had been married to her for 5 years, during which time he was emotionally abusive, manipulative, and controlling. He eventually moved to Queensland without her and started pursuing younger women online after she refused to work, living off her salary while pursuing a social work degree and posing as an entrepreneur. She claimed that I was the third woman to contact her in the previous few years, and we were all told the same story. So we all believed him when he used one to pay his so to get his clothes and flights. He lied, love-bombed, and manipulated, and when it became too near, he vanished with tales of ailing family members and unexpected crises. He was an experienced predator, and I blocked him everywhere. He harassed my phone and social media for a week until I said, "I know Marco, you should come clean." He panicked and told me he was travelling to Borleton, promising to explain everything. I told him I lived in Greenwich at the time, and he agreed. He flew, he trained, and I waited till he texted a picture of himself outside the station with bags at his feet in the rain. I told him I couldn't pick him up from the station, but I'd wait. Hours out, one train in and out every day. I'm not at the station. I never was, and you're alone now, just like the rest of us were when you used US to say goodbye. I blocked him after you lied about your identity, age, former marriage, and entire existence. It still takes me months to feel safe again, and I still get shivers when I see someone wearing a navy trench coat. However, if this story reaches even one person before they meet a Marco of their own, it's worth telling. Trust your gut no matter what. I was in my last year at Hartley University in Northern California, and I had just moved into a 2-bedroom on-campus apartment with 4 other females. The dorms were packed, and the apartment became more than simply 4 walls. My actual roommate, Nora, was a gem. We had been rooming together since sophomore year, and by the time senior year arrived, we were practically sisters, having chosen each other for every summer abroad program and even spring break. The school had converted some of the older staff housing into student apartments. We frequently joked that we had used up all of our roommate luck on each other during our adventures together, and perhaps we did. The other girls in the apartment were a mixed bag. Lydia and Tessa shared the second room, and Lydia was quiet, laid back, and somewhat artistic. Lydia had a revolving door of guys she brought home, and she had a boyfriend, a campus security officer named Damon. He wasn't just older and possessive. He carried a gun even when he wasn't on duty, and he had this barely contained rage bubbling beneath his legs. Lydia was chaotic, loud, unpredictable, and the kind of person who made a scene if there wasn't one already. Because Lydia enjoyed gambling with risk and the rest of us had to live in her casino, you might wonder why she even risked sneaking around with other guys, despite his polite exterior. It was March, when midterm stress was at its highest and spring parties were starting, and Friday night was St. Patrick's Day, and school had already let out. The campus was bustling with noise and alcohol from all the free concerts, food trucks, and green people everywhere. At around 8 o'clock, Tessa and Lydia left in their glitter and shamrocks, shouting over one another as they went, but Nora and I showed no interest. In around 11 p.m. we were halfway through a friend's marathon, so we got takeout and parked in front of the TV because the crowd had spent the day buried in paperwork and needed a mental break. Season 5, when we heard a man voice, somewhat drunk, hammering on the apartment door without knocking, saying, "Hey, can you let me in? I just need to borrow a phone." He seemed urgent, but neither panicked nor turned. He banged harder this time, saying, "Hello, My phone is dead. I just need to make a call. Can you let me in? I groaned, thinking it was one of Lydia's boys, or maybe someone looking for a party. However, that's not our business. Nora bit her lip as we glanced at the door. So we should help, right? I looked at her, and then I felt a strange knot in my stomach, like something wasn't right. Nope, I answered firmly. Let's pretend we're dozing off. He knocked a few more times, and then there was stillness. We held our breath for a minute, and when I looked through the peephole, nobody was there. Eventually, Nora curled up beneath her blanket and murmured, "I'm a creepy rando," turning the radio back up and trying to laugh it off. However, neither of us was able to completely shake the uneasiness before our phones buzzed in unison. It was a campus-wide alert, one of those automatic texts we occasionally receive. Cedar Hall was our campus location for power outages or lockdown exercises. An emergency alert incident was reported about a stabbing at Cedar Hall Apartments, with a suspect at a big avoid area. If feasible, authorities were examining my throat, but Cedar Hall was our Nora added, slowly, eyes scanning the alert again, as I turned to face her. "There was a stabbing here," she said, and we both sat still. I immediately accessed our campus news app, where people were already posting pictures and reports of a police car, an ambulance, and blood on a stairwell. After waiting for updates for half an hour, someone uploaded a picture of the exterior of Unit 14B, which is just above ours, on the anonymous campus message board. I can still clearly recall Nora saying, "No, it couldn't be, but it might have happened," and it turned out to be a girl in the apartment above us. She was a quiet transfer student named Amelia, and she had opened the door when a man knocked to borrow a phone. She let him in, and a few seconds later he took a kitchen knife off the counter and stabbed her 4 times in the stomach. The police couldn't find any connection between him and Amelia. He wasn't a staff member, he wasn't a student, and the attack seemed completely random. She was able to crawl to her door and scream before passing out, but the guy had simply vanished into the crowd of thousands of people who were drunk and dressed in costume that night. We didn't get much sleep before Nora threw her dresser against the door, and I sat in bed till 3 in the morning. There was no purpose, no stealing, nothing personal, just violence. I'm holding my metal water bottle like a weapon. In the morning, there was a sick silence that pervaded the building. Police officers were still canvassing, and campus officials were trying to appear composed while walking around in ties. I heard one of them say that the second apartment he knocked on was 14B. He attempted to unlock the first door, but it was probably ours because we lived just underneath them, adjacent to the stairway. I sat down on our couch, trembling, and kept repeating the phrase in my mind, "Can I borrow your phone?" The last we heard, Nora and I exchanged a look and muttered, "Holy_classes were cancelled on Monday." They said it was in solidarity, but everyone knew it was, because campus security had no leads and Amelia had barely survived. When she eventually returned to school the following day, still wearing glitter makeup, Lydia didn't even believe it at first because she was in the intensive care unit with a burst liver. She looked more irritated than anything, which is weird, so I guess I'm glad I wasn't home, Damon her cop. We didn't feel any safer for the remainder of the semester after the boyfriend appeared out of nowhere. Nora and I kept checking the peephole whenever someone knocked, and even after graduation, I couldn't hear a knock without getting shivers. I never found out who the guy was, and some people thought he was people with mental illnesses believe he killed someone to feel something. All I know is that he knocked on our door first, and we didn't answer. That brief moment of doubt may be the only reason I'm concerned. Years later, when I returned to see Nora in her new San Diego apartment, we were sharing memories from college and laughing over wine when I brought up the incident. Her fiancé leaned forward, asking whether it was the stabbing at Cedar Hall that made headlines. They never got the person, so I nodded slowly, but he shook his head, which is crazy. It makes you wonder where he went and what else he did, because the room fell silent, and I couldn't help but believe he might still be somewhere. I had not intended to go out that evening since, to be honest. It had already been a difficult week. With 2 shifts back-to-back at the veterinary clinic, my landlord raising the rent by $80 starting next month, and it was a Friday night in May, and the heat hadn't gone out even after sunset, so I remember looking at my friend Caleb cancelling our weekend plans for the 3rd time in a row. I was irritated, tipsy from cleaning after a few drinks, and buzzing with that particular restlessness that makes staying at home intolerable. At 10:37 p.m., I put on a black t-shirt, dress and sneakers, grabbed my crossbody bag and walked a few blocks from my apartment to the Foxhole, a little dive club. I didn't tell anyone I was going, not Kayla, but Decatur, Georgia, was my first mistake. I was a bit buzzed when I don't even remember their names, but 2 women asked if they could sit at my table for a while, and we talked. They were friendly, likely dealing with their own restlessness, and then they left to go dancing, leaving me by myself once more. That's when I noticed a man with a thick, dark mustache and a man with pale, stretched skin sat alone at a high-top table across from me. He wasn't drinking or chatting to anyone. Instead, he was merely observing me. His gaze had weight, as if he were looking across the room. Was making a mark on me with his gaze, so I looked away, assuming it was something to do with drugs, mental condition, or both. I didn't feel cute or flirty, so it was puzzling but not dangerous yet. I was finishing my drink and deciding whether to get another, or I had just taken an Uber home when he showed up. "You're Morgan, right?" he said, and his voice came from right next to me. I hadn't seen him get up or move across the room. He was just sitting at my little table, sitting next to me, as if we had known each other for years. I was surprised and looked up from my using a forced smile. I answered, "Nope," and I gave him my real name, which, in hindsight, was mistake number 3. He didn't respond to my correction. Instead, he shook his head slowly once, saying, "No, you're Morgan. That's your name." There was a moment between us that became uncomfortable, so I tried to dismiss it by half laughing and said, "Okay, I'm not, but what's up?" His eyes were the kind of green you never forget, to bright, to cold. "What do you want to own someday, Morgan?" My heart hammered my ribs as he leaned in just a little, his face uncomfortably closed. I should have ignored him and gotten up, but I was intoxicated and didn't want to make things worse, so I responded, "I don't know nothing." He repeated, "What do you want to own someday?" As if it were a completely normal question to ask a stranger at a bar. Truly, his expression changed. His brow furrowed in disgust, and he gave me the kind of look someone might give a stray dog that has bitten them. "That's pathetic," he said. I felt myself dwindling beneath his stare as he said bluntly, "Everyone wants to own something." He clicked his tongue and stared at me, as if I had failed an exam. "But you don't deserve one." I stared, my heart thumping, and he said, almost whispering, "Don't get houses." I tried to laugh, but he interrupted me with a slow, knowing smile that stopped short of his eyes, saying, "You can sit." I tried to put it off as a joke, but it was just that, a joke. "Here, but only if you're not on anything, not drinking more tonight, and not planning to murder me. I can't promise I'm going to let you survive," he said in response to my anxious, stupid joke. The air grew colder, and my skin pricked like I had been thrown in a freezer. I've heard that line in crime shows, fiction books, and it's usually melodramatic, but the way he said it, and the way his eyes met mine, with a prehistoric stillness, made it clear that he meant it. I got up so quickly that my drink spilled over the edge of the table, and I said to no one in particular, "I need to go." Heading straight for "that guy's freaking me out," I murmured, pointing to Mustache Man, as I moved in near the bartender, Trish, who had served me many times. "He said he might kill me, and I think he's on something," I continued. She simply nodded sharply and summoned over the man with the mustache. He didn't fight or protest. He simply got up, grinned at me once more, and left like whether the first succeeded or failed. It was part of his plan. I phoned an Uber before I left the house, and while I drove home, I kept checking over my shoulder and secured my apartment door. The next morning, I told myself, maybe he was high, maybe it was nothing, maybe he just liked screwing with drunk women in bars, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. How did he know the name Morgan? Why did he get so upset when I gave the wrong answer? The chair under the knob slept with a kitchen knife under my pillow. A few days later, I returned to the foxhole early in the evening before it became crowded. Trish was there, and I nervously thanked her once more before asking, "Hey, has that man returned?" She gave me an odd look. I didn't kick anyone out on Friday. We didn't have any problems. I was the only one working until midnight. I opened my mouth and closed it, but I did find this. "Look who it is, the mustache guy from Friday that you kicked out." She gazed for a moment before saying slowly, "Sweetie, she pulled something from under the bar behind the seat you were in while I was cleaning, thinking it might be yours. When I opened it, my skin went cold, and it was a napkin folded twice, with the words 'You don't even know who you are. I'll see you' written in a messy, all caps font. Morgan once more. After changing my hair and going to the store during the day rather than at night, I never returned to the foxhole. I told my friends everything, filed a police report, and even bought pepper spray, but I don't think I ever saw him again. Occasionally, though, I'll catch a glimpse of someone on the street with green eyes and a mustache, and my breath catches because I'm afraid I'm Morgan, or worse, I might have been the wrong girl in the I was raised in a neighborhood called Willow Creek Hollow, which is about 15 to 20 minutes east of downtown Cleveland. It was one of those suburban areas you see on postcards, with spacious streets surrounded with trees. The next one won't be as fortunate. Every house was just far enough apart to allow for breathing room without making you feel alone. And in the fall, ancient maple trees spilled over. People smiled as they walked their dogs, and in the summer, kids played street hockey. It was safe, calm, and occasionally too quiet. Although I liked it, there is one aspect of it, the Harringtons, that I wish I could totally delete. If you have ever lived next door, you will always have that location tucked away in the back of your heart like a cozy blanket. You can unfurl when the actual world becomes too noisy. You might be able to relate to individuals who make you uneasy without ever breaking the law, but the Harringtons were more than just your typical nightmare neighbors. They elevated dysfunction to the point where you began to question whether evil traits like poor vision or high cholesterol could be hereditary. When I was around 15, the four of them, Miles, the father, Dolores, the mother, and their two sons, Evan and Lyle, moved in. I recall the moving truck because I saw it arrive on a soggy Tuesday morning in March from my upstairs bedroom, as a man in a Miles Harrington, wearing a Hawaiian shirt and jeans with large bleach stains, gave orders to the movers as if he was conducting a military operation. From the first day, the man exuded the bad vibes. He was tall, slumped slightly at the neck, and looked like a vulture that was constantly chewing gum, or it was like a threat wrapped in syrup. Dolores was odd. She looked like she had been trying to win a pageant that had ended 20 years ago. Covered in makeup and perfume, he had a habit of smiling at you with only the bottom half of his face, and his eyes remained dead if he said hello. She wore clothes that were out of style, such as tight satin blouses, leopard designs, and high heels to go grocery shopping, and she was powerful enough to smell from across the street, but she hardly ever spoke, preferring to observe. Their older Evan was around 17 or 18 years old at the time. He was constantly wearing a sweatshirt. His face was mostly covered by his oily brown hair. He slouched, and he had a habit of using markers to write on his arms. According to my friend Jess, she once witnessed him using a marker to carve something into a tree, switchblade, followed by Lyle, the younger, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, thinner than paper, barefoot, and always carrying a Polaroid camera. He would snap pictures of people passing by, dogs, mailboxes, automobiles, trees, and other objects. But he never took them, snapped them, and left without saying anything. We all tried to ignore them. Strange neighbors aren't against the law, but little things began to happen gradually. My first real experience was in my junior year of high school, as I was returning from Jess's house at twilight. After we had spent the afternoon putting off our trig homework and watching idiotic horror films, I saw Lyle sitting on the curb at 114 Willow Lane, the Harrington residence, clutching something in his hand. As I approached his lap, I saw that it was a dead rabbit with its eyes open and its stomach ripped out like a wet zipper. I let out a tiny cry and exclaimed, "What the hell?" I raced the rest of the way home after he murmured that it was still warm after taking a Polaroid click flash without even looking up. Things got out of hand when my neighbor across the street, Mr. Bernard, revealed that Miles Harrington had placed a letter on his car's windshield claiming, "Don't effing park here again," they said. The problem was that, according to my friend Rachel's younger brother, Mr. Bernard hadn't had his tires cut that week. One day, Evan followed him from the park to their block, just far enough to avoid being caught, but close enough to frighten the child into insanity. We all exchanged stories in low tones, like combat veterans, but nobody could prove anything because that's how they worked. My most unsettling encounter with Miles Harrington occurred at the petrol station off Route 43. It was late, perhaps 9:30, and I had hurried outside to get tampons and a Coke. As I was making my way to the drinks, I heard someone behind me say "sunlight in the evening." With his hands in his jacket pockets and that same half grin, he was leaning against the snack aisle. His eyes were dimly lighted, but alert. When I looked back, he was standing far too near. "Don't worry," he added. "You're growing up nice, Bet. The boys at your school can hardly keep their mouths shut." I nodded hurriedly and continued going, collecting my drink, when my mother requested me to deliver a letter that had been accidentally placed in our mailbox. I was really anxious, but she persisted. I froze. He laughed, and he left as if it had never happened. I didn't even purchase the Coke. Dolores answered the door with a ball of yarn in one hand and what appeared to be a chipped porcelain doll head in the other. She looked at me for what seemed like an age before grinning and saying, "Oh, sweetheart, did you know? Ring Around the Rosie was about the plague." Huh. I believe I've heard that some people claim it's a hoax, but I believe that some things are remembered for a reason, don't you? She was still grinning as she closed the door, and Lyle was watching me from the window the entire time, holding that awful camera. One evening in late November, something happened that truly rocked the neighborhood. Ashley, a quiet, shy kid who loved computer science and chess, disappeared. Her parents claimed she went on a walk and never returned, despite search parties, posters, and local press coverage. A week later, her backpack was discovered in the woods behind Willow Lane, ripped and filthy with Polaroids inside, not photos of her, but of us neighborhood kids, and you could plainly see a portion of a Harrington mailbox in one frame's corner. The police interrogated them, but they had no concrete evidence, so they were free to go without being charged or anything. Winter arrived, and with it came silence. That year, no one trick-or-treated, and the caroling doors remained locked. We all held our breath together, expecting that the Harringtons would simply leave. Then, one night, at approximately 3 in the morning, I woke up to my mother yelling, and I fled outside the Harrington house fire, seeing flames streaming from the top level, sirens wailing in the background, and Lyle standing motionless in the street with a Polaroid camera in one hand that was singed at the edges, but unharmed was something I never found out about. The Harringtons vanished that night, and the official narrative was an electrical malfunction. However, tales circulated about what caused the fire, including gas leaks, arson, and even punishment from above, as Mr. Bernard stated with shaking lips. "I'm 28 years old, married, and now live far away. house of my own, but occasionally I still feel like I'm being watched. Last month, a parcel arrived without a return address, and inside were 7 Polaroids, one of which was shot from outside my house and contained information on me, my husband, and my child. When I was 11 years old, the sun was high, the world outside your front door was calling to you with the laughing of other kids, and I thought my mom disliked fun. It was the simplest conclusion to draw as a child. A handwritten message in red marker, still warm. We lived on a dead-end street in a working-class neighborhood called Pinefield Terrace, just south of Bakersfield, California. The houses were modest, but not quite falling apart, and the streets were bordered by Dutch chain-link fences and the shrill my mom, Lena Morales, worked her jobs to keep the roof over our heads. She had my sister, Camila, when she was 17, and me 2 years later. My dad was never around. We lived in a pale blue house with paint peeling like old sunburn. There was the sound of barking dogs at every other property. We didn't have much, but Mom always made sure we had food, clothes, and a small used TV that only had 3 channels if the antenna was angled just right. At the time, I didn't care about any of that. All I saw was a prison with a window overlooking the outside world. Camilla's father also died in a car accident before she was even born. She would tell us that everyone else was out there, but I would argue, pressing my face against the glass, and that's precisely why you're not. She never raised her voice or explained, but her eyes would glaze over and her voice would sound flat, as if it took I detested everything about her, including the way she would double lock the doors and peer through the curtains before letting anyone in. I also detested the fact that we couldn't go to the corner store together and had to wait for her, if we wanted anything, to leave work and accompany us. She managed our every move, our social lives, and even what we watched. At the time, I believed she was simply overly protective and possibly insane. But years later, after I had moved away for college, we had what would turn out to be one of the most candid talks of my life, discovered the precise reason behind her behavior, and it completely altered my perception of my early years. It began with the house next door, not quite next door, but one house over, separated by an empty lot that was constantly overflowing with weeds and abandoned beer cans. Was a squat, beige rectangle with aluminum foil covering the windows and a garage door that never opened. People came and went at all hours, but they seldom stayed long. Occasionally, at 2 or 3 in the morning, headlights would sweep over the ceiling of our bedroom and voices would drift through the window frame cracks. I heard loud laughter and screaming one moment, followed by glass breaking, and what I now know was a gunshot. But at the time, it all blended together to create the strange nighttime music of Pinefield Terrace. As a child, I called the after bedtime. Camila and I would challenge each other to peek through the blinds in the hopes of catching a glimpse of the night family. We would make up stories about them being vampires, spies, or alien hunters, but the truth was far worse. I never told you because I didn't want you to grow up afraid, my mother said. We were sitting on the back patio of her new duplex in Stockton, miles away from the house where we had grown up. In the summer after my sophomore year of college, Camel was cooking supper, and I had just told my mother how different life had been since I left, and how I had never realized how uptight I had been growing up until I didn't feel that way longer. So she became quiet. I'm not sure if I said the right thing, but she said, "Keeping you and your sister locked in like that is the last resort." I couldn't take the chance, so I looked at her and noticed something for the first time. She was terrified even now, so far away from everything, and I didn't recognize that vulnerability in her as a youngster. What was the risk? I questioned, and she hesitated before responding. You remember the Flers house, the Knight family? They would usually give them meth to get high, and once they were addicted, they would be distributed to others who paid as well as to others in the house. I gulped hard, but she wasn't finished. They would capture photos and videos and use them as blackmail. If you want your parents to see this, they'd or will notify the police that you're a drug dealer, you say. These females were stuck, and they had no idea how to escape. Some of them brought their friends, believing that the party was merely a way for them to grow. Their circle made my skin crawl, and they attempted to entice Camila. When she offered, "Come hang out with us tonight, we got a deadly quiet," I froze. She was 12 years old, pizza and a trampoline. Jesus, in front of her, I ripped it up and said her to never speak to anyone from that house again. So I began to lock everything up and keep you two inside. I kept a close eye on that place and was unable to speak, but they claimed to know I was there. So that's when she told me about when Mom returned home from work. Boys who weren't much older than me would sometimes stop her outside. "If you believe you're better than us, don't meddle in our affairs. The next time you look out your window, it might be the last thing you see." She tried calling the police when a patrol car passed by, but they didn't enter Flora's house. Instead, they drove by. She discovered a dead cat on our porch with its throat cut and something carved into its fur. She never told us about it. Instead, she threw it in a trash bag and burned it in the alley behind the house, scrawled a note carefully and left it there. A week later, our car was vandalized and someone spray painted the word rat on our fence. Mom never called again, she said. "I couldn't afford to move. I couldn't afford to send you away to school or live somewhere safer. So all I could do was keep you inside," she added, dabbing at her eyes. The residence was eventually invaded. At 4 a.m., SWAT teams, helicopters, and flashbangs occurred. Camila was in high school at the time, and I was already enrolled in college. Everyone found dozens of girls' guns, cash, narcotics, and something else on the altar in the garage. Mom muttered images, bones, chickens, and candles, and they worshipped something called Santo Muerte. A skeletal folk saint of some people worship death as a barrier against evil, while others utilize it for protection. I used to hear chanting at night, and she mentioned roosters shrieking and goats. I assumed they were offering animal sacrifices, but I didn't ask what was worst. I didn't want to know, so we sat in silence. Then, the backyard got colder and the shadows lasted longer. I turned to face my mother, who I used to believe was unjust and cruel, but who was actually afraid, and I muttered, "Don't be," but she was brave and added, "I'm sorry," adding, "Just don't ever go back there." 6 months later, the mansion was razed because there were too many bodies and too much negative publicity. Discovered beneath the floorboards, leveling it was less expensive than selling it, and now it's just a field of broken glass and dirt. But I still dream about it, the girl in the pink sneakers, the flickering candlelight behind the foil-covered windows, the dead cat, the murmurs coming through the wall, and on peaceful nights, I occasionally hear a voice in the darkness that is too piercing to ignore or too low to interpret, and I imagine my mother waiting and watching from the window. I grew up in Fairview, a little town in northern Pennsylvania. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to have many problems. There was snow in the winter, baseball in the summer, and mainly private neighbors. My family wasn't wealthy, but we were secure since my dad worked for the trouble began when the Daltons moved in next door. Our old neighbors, the Parkers, were a sweet retired couple who baked pies and waved at you whenever you passed them. My mom and the county water department cleaned houses for a living, and I was 19 years old, working part-time at a grocery store and taking online college courses. We were all sad to see them leave when they pulled into your driveway when they moved to Florida, but almost immediately after, this family of 5 showed up and moved in without any small talk or introductions. They had a beat-up van, a trailer full of furniture, and they were shouting angrily as they unloaded it. At first, we didn't think much of it, because new people are always a little reserved. Perhaps they would come around, but they didn't. Keith, the father, was a heavy-set man with a permanent frown and a receding hairline. His wife, Janelle, appeared to have gone weeks without sleep, smoking constantly, and her eyes darted around as if she was neurotic. They had 3 children, to boys who were around 9 and 11, and a teenage girl named Lily, who couldn't have been older than 16. Lily never spoke or smiled, instead spending her evenings sitting on the porch with her knees drawn to her chest and gazing out at the woods behind our house. My mom tried to be friendly by bringing over banana bread, but Janelle took it without saying anything. She didn't invite her in. Instead, she simply closed the door in her face. That was the last time we made an attempt to be friendly for 2 months. The only time I saw her show even the smallest emotion was when she looked scared. Began to hear the music, not just loud, earth-shattering music around midnight, and continued until 3 or 4 in the morning. The bass was so deep that it shattered our windows, and at first we assumed it was simply children being silly. But later we saw it was intentional every time when my dad yelled back that he was calling the police. Keith walked outside and snarled at him, saying, "You ever come onto my property?" Dad went over to ask them to turn it down, saying that they would either ignore the knocking or yell through the door that we should mind our own business. Once more, he snarled, inches from my dad's nose, and threatened to bury you beneath it. We contacted the police multiple times, and they arrived, but all they could do was make noise. Keith always appeared composed when they arrived, as if he could turn a switch and act innocent. But we began to notice things like how one week Chanel would have new bruises on her arms and Keith would arrive with a black eye, the next screaming. Matches sounded like thunder, slamming doors, shattering glass, and so on. You were helpless to do anything but listen to the violence that made your stomach turn in the middle of the night. And I once caught poor Lily trying to slip out the side gate at around 2 in the morning. I was about to shout out to her when she saw me watching and stopped in fear. But Keith's voice roared from the porch, "Get your ass back inside," and she ran without hesitation. My mom sobbed that night, saying she should have one night after another. My dad contacted Child Protection Services and said, "You think they'll be able to do anything by the time they investigate that girl might be dead?" He didn't realize how correct he was. At 3 a.m., there was a round of yelling and thuds on the wall before the music permanently ceased and the lights went out. It seemed as though the house had fallen silent, because there was no more shouting or fighting on the driveway. When we saw the boys playing in the backyard during the day, hurling sticks and shouting at each other as if nothing had changed, Mom believed they could have finally been evicted, and Dad thought Keith had been arrested. Janelle would come out to smoke, and Keith was still when I asked one of the lads, who was riding his bike down the street, "Hey, where's your sister?" He gave me this. We were doing beer runs at the gas station, but Lily was gone. At first, we assumed she was just inside, but after a week, we began to wonder. 2 weeks later, there were police officers on the street, marked cars, unmarked cars, forensics vans, and people in white suits hauling bags and boxes in and out of the Daltons' house. He remarked, "Weird look." She ran away and drove off as if it were nothing, but something about it lingered with me. The official tale took some time to put together, but the local media filled in most of the gaps. Lily had, in fact, fled to a nearby location. We were taped off for over 4 days, had to make statements, and the police even searched our backyard to check this they had thrown anything over the fence. She spent roughly 5 days at the shelter 2 towns over before Keith and Janelle discovered her. Security footage showed them dragging her into their van in the parking lot, but no one intervened because they were still legally her guardians. They then took her into the woods close to Lake Elms, beat her, and left her to perish. Whether deliberate or not, they never phoned for help or took her to the hospital. Instead, they buried her dead in a small grave next to Keith's cousin's old hunting shack, where he confessed when the police interrogated him and broke after 4 hours of according to the details of the interview. He only intended to discipline her for fleeing. The injuries were more severe than I could have imagined, including broken ribs, a cracked cranium, and stomach bruising. There was also evidence of older injuries, which suggested the abuse had been occurring for years. Janelle was also arrested, helped hide it. They were both accused of second-degree murder, abuse, neglect, and obstruction of justice. I'm not sure what happened to the boys. They were either placed in foster care or sent to a relative. The house was for sale last fall, and someone eventually purchased it, flipped it, and moved in. They'll never know what happened, occurred inside those walls. We still reside in Fairview, but things have changed. My mom has the curtains shut at all times, and my dad placed cameras around the home. I still get shivers whenever I see a white van pass by, and occasionally I think of Lily. The fact that we were only a wall away the entire time, even when evil lives next door, is what worries me the most about the way she seemed at night, while crouching on the porch and gazing at the trees. She knew what was coming and lived in hell without anybody saving her. I grew up in a small town called Grennan, which is tucked away in the English countryside. It's the kind of town where everything closes by 6 o'clock and rumour spreads quicker than cars. I don't think anything especially noteworthy ever happened there. If you had told me as a child that the most horrifying crime in our county's history would occur right down my street one day, I would have realised that you could live in Grenton for the rest of your life without locking your doors or worrying about your neighbours. Laughed not because it was humorous, but because it simply didn't account for the Prestwood family. Odd, yes, and reclusive, but evil isn't anything we knew how to call it back then. Let me begin at the beginning. When Elliot Prewood was just my mum cooked a lemon drizzle cake to welcome the Prestwoods when they moved into the corner house on Wexley Lane the summer before I started primary school. But they never answered the door they just glanced in. It was a weird lad in class, and not someone I knew well. They were distant and closed off from the beginning. The mother, Diane, was hardly ever seen outside of hanging clothes in the same grey outfit, while the father, Martin Prestwood, worked night shifts at a nearby distribution facility, jumper, even in warm weather. And they had a child named Elliot. At first, Elliot was different, but not in a negative way. He didn't say a single word in class for the first 2 years, which is to say that we all assumed he had some students, and teachers kind of skirted it. But one day in year 3, he effortlessly and flawlessly answered a question on the Romans, and the class fell silent. I remember what he said, not only because it was odd, but also because it was so accurate. Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC. It was too brutal. And then there was silence once more, as if someone had turned a switch on and off. I recall staring at him, but he didn't smile or appear proud. Straightforward. That was Elliot's genius in a subtly unsettling manner, as if someone was home but didn't want you to come. We were 10 years old when the first obvious indication of a problem appeared. It was during recess, and a child named Frankie Bowl had stolen Elliot's pencil case and tossed it across the yard. It wasn't even particularly cruel. It was just playground bullshit. Instead of shouting or complaining, Elliot just went over, picked up the pencil case, and then strolled back, gently headbutting Frankie in the nose without pushing him. When the teachers pulled them apart and began yelling, Elliot just stood there as if nothing had happened. Frankie went down screaming, bleeding all over his face after he hit him and planted his forehead there like it was planned. Elliot said one thing he needed to learn. The Prestwoods were a private family. So that's the line we all used back then. He was suspended for a week, which should have been a greater red flag. But again, it's a little community where people assume oddness is just eccentricity. Elliot was tall and thin by secondary school, but he wasn't sick. He was just sharp-looking. He didn't talk much, but when he did, he was fluent and incredibly perceptive. He once told an English teacher that she had a twitch in her eye sat next to him in math one year, and we all believed the lies she told about her right eye. Rumours circulated that he injured animals, was fascinated by biology's anatomy section, and never blinked in class. He may have been exaggerating, but we all believed them. Of his notebook was painstakingly filled with notes, underlining, and diagrams, But what struck me most was how consistently he wrote each letter, as if it had been printed. Occasionally, he would murmur something under his breath, not notes, not responses, just words. At one point, I heard him say, a hammer's best. The edge breaks, but it's difficult to track down, so I simply stopped using his pens without asking. By this point, the Presswood house had the town's lights would flicker on and off at odd times, and many reported hearing screams late at night. The curtains were always drawn. And then there was the pantsless event. It was chilly in the winter, and Elliot was dropped off for school in his full uniform, save for one of the teachers wrapped him in a blanket after he walked across the chilly yard wearing only his underwear and a jacket. When she questioned him what had happened, he reportedly replied, "Dad said Shane teaches urgency, at least not at that time. No social workers arrived," but the tale quickly went around, shocking the staff and us all, but nothing much changed. Until on Monday morning, Elliot arrived at school wearing sneakers, jeans, and a hoodie, not even his uniform, and for the first time, he appeared nearly at ease. He even grinned at our science instructor, leaving everyone perplexed. We later discovered that he was different from that day on. He played football with us during break time, not very well, but he tried. He asked questions, and by lunchtime, he had a completely new uniform and a brand new bag that the school had paid for. I recall him inviting me and a few others back to his house one Friday, saying he got a new PlayStation and snacks. I said no, and we all agreed that perhaps the school had finally stepped in, and he was finally out of that house, busy, and he just nodded. In retrospect, I can see what was inside that house when he invited us over after a 3-day weekend in May, when Elliot failed to show up for school on Monday, Tuesday, or Friday. When police sirens raced along Wexley Lane on Saturday night, my mother yanked back the curtain and exclaimed, "Oh my God!" There were 4 police officers and ambulances. The story didn't break right away because there were no kids involved, but tiny towns are like calendars and everything seeps, so by the next week, the truth came out in rumors and to bodies. Martin and Diane Elliot went missing for 36 hours after the discovery, but they eventually located him. He had many fractures and pre-would blunt forceful trauma, but there were no signs of forced entry or struggle, just death. He instantly admitted to sleeping in a drainage culvert beneath the freeway while wrapped in a school gym blanket. He claimed to have done it on Saturday morning, to have changed his clothing and put on gloves, to have waited until they were both asleep, and to have used a hammer, taken weeks earlier from the school's maintenance closet, wore earplugs to block out the noise, and spent 2 days hiding the bodies under their own bed before going to school, playing football, laughing, and living while they deteriorated upstairs. He even invited people over as if it were the law protected his identity. At least in the press, but Grenton knew, we all knew, hence it in the way people talked, the way they avoided eye contact, the way conversations died, and when children asked questions, he was sent away. It was a test to see if he could fake it long enough to avoid being caught. Elliot was 13 at the time. Some people claimed he was being researched while in juvenile mental incarceration, while others claimed he had escaped once and had to be sent again. The reality is, I don't know, but I do know that he completely changed our village. We stopped labeling individuals weird and assumed that private meant harmless, and I still remember that afternoon to this day. If I had agreed to visit his place, what would I have discovered, smelled, and most terrifying of all, what would Elliot have done? The thing that scares me the most is not that he did it, but rather that it worked. If it worked once, who's to say he won't try it again? You can remove a boy from a house of horrors, but you can't always remove the horror from the boy. Sometimes I wonder if killing his parents freed him, because it seemed like he had shed something toxic. Every time I think about that night, every time I try to fall asleep, and every time I hear the wind hitting my windows in the wrong direction, I think I should have followed my gut. That night wasn't some urban explorer gone wrong story. It wasn't spooky, wasn't enjoyable, and I never should have agreed to it. I'm not even one who typically engages in such activities, nor am I a thrill seeker or a horror junkie. But my closest friend Jay always had that tall, slim attitude that suggested nothing could ever touch me. We had been friends since middle school and remained close even as we grew older. But he never outgrew the desire to visit strange abandoned locations and snap eerie pictures for social media. He had that unwavering smirk if he had seen the worst and burst out laughing. He texted, "Jay, yo, you up found something sick you ever heard of Ridgeview Asylum?" on a Thursday night in May. I remember this because I had just returned from working to shifts at the car shop, and all I wanted to do was eat some leftover pasta and pass out in front of the TV. I hesitated before responding. Me, the one that's not inside Iron Hollow. Jay, that location has been boarded up for more than 20 years. I sighed as I made my way back. Iron Hollow was a half-dead hamlet in western Pennsylvania, about 25 minutes west of Weyburn. I had once driven past Ridgeview during a storm, and it looked just like what you would expect from an old asylum. Jay knew that I detested anything related to asylums because I lost a cousin to suicide when I was 15. We weren't close, but the burial stayed with me because of the agony in his life. The tall grey stone building had boarded up windows and ivy crawling up the sides as if nature was trying to suffocate the place. I didn't like places where people had been forgotten and kept away, but Jay could pass for someone 10 minutes later when he stood outside my apartment in his dingy Ford Focus with the missing hubcap and the red ball for me. Mom's expression and the whispered rumors I should have said hell no in the cup holder, but instead I said, "Let's make it quick." The asylum's road wound through a small area of trees that resemble long, dark fingers extending toward the sky. Halfway down the dirt path, Jay turned off the headlights and coasted until we came to the rusting chain that once blocked the driveway. Believe me, he claimed that no one had visited this location in years. It was a huge 3-story building with a broken fire escape that appeared to be part of it, and a collapsed annex off to the left would disintegrate if you even sneezed on it. So we hopped the chain and headed for the side entrance. During one of his weekend trips, Jay had scouted it earlier that week and had been itching to enter ever since, because as we arrived at the building's side, I looked up and, I swear to God, I stopped cold when Jay saw that someone was seeing us from the 3rd-story window. "Someone is up there on the far right side of the top floor." He turned and stared at us both. A pale face was seen in the window, motionless, and stone eyes were fixed on us. "All right," Jay continued slowly, "that either we're going to encounter the ghost of Ridgeview himself, or there's a squatter." I didn't. The idiot waved up at the figure. "Hey you," but I didn't even smile. The figure moved away from the window and vanished into the darkness. "Dude, selling meth or ghost feelings?" "No," I responded. He said, "Creaks, come. That's a bad indication. Let's bounce. It's simply someone concealing." He didn't wait for me. Instead, he pushed. "We'll be in and out all the time." Opened a loose piece of metal that had served as a door, slipped inside, and defied my want to scream. The first thing that struck me was the stench of corroded metal and ancient mildew. Our flashlights danced across graffiti-covered walls that were covered in layers of decay that seemed to have been fermenting for a long time. The majority of it is dumb crap like "I see you," "Hell is empty," and someone's cartoon penis. Jay read aloud, "I love it when they run after giving bat wings. Damn edgy. A lot." Mold was prevalent in the air, and we trod on broken glass. In one passage, I remained just behind Jay's eyes despite towels and a disintegrating gurney. The deeper we went, the more the structure seemed strange, not haunted, but wrong, and we had to flick back every few seconds. We discovered a stairwell that seemed to be watching us, as if the walls remembered something. They made their way to the 2nd floor, which had lengthy hallways with doorways leading to the patient rooms, Jay took pictures while mumbling, "Man, this is a tiny square with a rusty bed frame and peeling green paint." I hardly heard him, but look at the texture on that wall, gold. I was concentrating on there was a deep silence. And then we heard heavy footsteps above us. Jay froze with his camera half up as I paced deliberately and stopped. Whispering he didn't respond, and instead turned his gaze on what he believed to be a squatter. "Let's inspect the third story in the next stairway. If it seems suspicious, we'll depart." I wanted to say no, but I also didn't want to be by myself in the hallway. The air felt heavier and colder as soon as we entered the third story, as if it were filled with an unseen substance. And thick, with a distinct, coppery smell reminiscent of wet fur and ancient blood. Not simply graffiti, but pentagrams, crosses, made of animal bones, and other symbols were all over the walls. Appeared to be a scroll in a brownish-red color, and one of the rooms included actual cages. Jay lowered his voice as he turned to face me. "All right, this is becoming very strange." No underscore, we moved toward the far end, where we noticed the individual in the window. Jay focused his light on a single chamber in the center, and from within, we could hear barely perceptible software whispering, but I muttered, "Go," and Jay didn't move. Instead, he began filming. Something, not a ghost, not a shadow, a middle-aged guy emerged from the chamber. His eyes were off. He was a tall, pallid man wearing what appeared to be ripped, dirty scrubs. He noticed us, grinned, and ran at us, yelling like he was not crazy or focused. Screaming, a banshee, Jay said, "Run." I ran down the stairs, while stumbling, over rubble. I didn't even check when I heard Jay behind me, but I did notice the window halfway down. I didn't think I just dove glass, but the second-floor passage was partially broken with no railings. I ripped into my jeans and hoodie, fell hard to the ground, and rolled into the weeds. My elbow stung and my foot twisted, but I continued running until I came to a dilapidated tall shed on the other side of the overgrown courtyard. As my breath caught in my throat, I tried not to vomit, but then I thought of Jay and texted him, asking, "Where are you? Did you make it out?" After 3 minutes without a response, I noticed Jay running across the lawn is as pale as hell, and there are 2 figures behind him besides the man in scrubs. Jay, another too short person in a mask, said, "Run." I didn't hold off till we headed toward the road together, but as soon as we came to the train tracks, we jumped into a ditch and lay there mud-covered, breathing dead leaves. We turned to see 2 men standing in the doorway. As they turned and vanished back inside, they watched us motionless like statues. Didn't call the police, we didn't upload the pictures, and we erased everything. Jay informed me what had happened on the way home. He attempted to follow me after I leapt, but he became alarmed and fled behind a stack of metal boxes next to the elevator shaft after spotting a man and another man were whispering as they passed. And then my text message was sent. When they heard it, they turned, he ran, and we followed, but we never spoke again about it once more. But I consider it each night, not only the faces, not only the chase, but given that someone was already up there, watching and waiting for a long time, I can't stop wondering what would have happened if we had entered that building previously. Entered the middle room. What if we had lingered there for an additional 5 minutes? We'll never know what they're doing in that asylum, and I don't want to know.